I guess I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My name is Darren Hulst, and I lead our commercial marketing team at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And I'm here to give you kind of a hybrid between a market update and a little bit of a kind of a product review, if that makes sense. And so probably take about 30-ish minutes, and then after that we can do a little bit of Q&A as well. And like I said, really happy to see everybody, a lot of familiar faces. Really happy that it's not the same temperature it was 2 years ago when we were here. But again, I think great turnout means there's still a lot to talk about in commercial aviation. And what's interesting to me is when we think about, this year, obviously very dynamic year in so many ways. Also, looking back at where the industry was 20 years ago and where we thought the market would be is kind of fascinating as well. And as the dates kind of lined up, what's interesting about 20 years ago from a Boeing commercial perspective is that there were a number of milestones in 2004 that kind of coincide now 20 years later. So interesting, just to quickly look back, obviously the past kind of does inform the future in many ways, but it's also interesting to see some of the milestones and also some of the things that happened over the course of the last 20 years. In 2004, we delivered the 1500th NG. We launched the 7E7, which turned into the 787. We rolled out our 500th 777, which I know obviously many more rolled out after that. And we produced our final 757. So kind of fascinating year in history, and also in terms of what we projected. So in 2004, our Boeing team, I was not yet a member of the Boeing Commercial Market Outlook team, but they did a pretty good job considering. If you look at 2004, what we projected in terms of airplane deliveries, when you look at 2004 in terms of how we projected 20-year commercial aviation traffic, we were remarkably on target, I would say. In fact, we over forecast deliveries by a fraction. And if you think about what happened in 2020, 2021, and 2022, and frankly even 2023 in terms of airplane deliveries, we would have actually under forecast the market if it weren't for the production challenges that the industry's had as a result of the pandemic. So remarkably on target in many ways, but if you look at how the deliveries came out, we were also off target as well, because if you look at the composition of deliveries, we pretty much hit the top line, but under forecast the amount of single aisle aircraft that the industry needed. Think about low cost carriers, emerging markets, and all the things that happened in the last 20 years. And we over forecast regional jets because, again, when we think about how the market evolved, the economics, the resources, and just the global demand really were overwhelmed on the single aisle and partially even on the wide body side. So interesting to look at those dynamics, but if you think about the global financial crisis, if you think about and consider the profound impact of the pandemic, but also the I would say the high growth years between 2015 and 2019, it's remarkable to see where traffic has come to as a result of demand over the last 20 years, and how remarkably close to that traffic number we came despite the challenges and many of the successes of the last 20 years. So going forward, I think the best thing to say to sum it all up is the market's proven its resilience, but also the market's been remarkably, I say, consistent in terms of the relationship that the things we look at in terms of measuring demand, in terms of looking for key trends. Those key trends are here. Those fundamentals are still in place and drive the market for the future. And this is just another view of that in terms of how we're looking at demand drivers for the future. Fundamentally, air travel growth outpaces economic growth. So, for example, if the economy globally on average over the last 4 decades has grown about 3%, air travel grows about 5% per year. And the reason for that is tied to the value that connecting economies makes, but also in terms of people entering the middle class. It's not just overall GDP, it's GDP per capita, it's connectivity, and it's also innovation of business models across the system. And you can see there's different speeds of growth depending on where different economies are, moving from developing to emerging to advanced economies, and also the size of the traffic, the size of the markets. So the largest markets in the world, like the US domestic market, may not be growing at 5% per year, but it's very mature and continues on a growth trajectory. So with that in mind, a couple things I think as we continue to bounce back between 2004 and today, you can see some interesting additional trends, and I think this all ties back to innovation that happens in the airline business, but also in the airplane business. Air travel is still remarkably affordable. Despite the fact that yields have gone up over the course of the post-pandemic years, we're looking at yields on a nominal basis that are essentially the same as they were 20 years ago. So when you adjust for inflation, yields are half of what they were in 2004. Traffic's back. Traffic has more than doubled over the course of the last 20 years, and yields are essentially flat. So it's an incredible value. And again, the airplanes that have come into the market, the efficiencies that have come into the market have helped enable that. But airlines have too, with what they've done with the airplanes that have been delivered to the marketplace. And this is just maybe another way of looking at that. Efficiency continues to improve. Fleet efficiency continues to improve. The new airplane technology that comes into the system has helped and enabled airlines to essentially become about 2 to 3% better in terms of fuel efficiency per year. There were some disruptions during the pandemic as we saw load factors drop, utilization drop, but we're reacquiring that trend as we deliver more new technology aircraft to the market now and going forward into the future. And so those trends are obviously a tailwind to airline economics and the fuel costs, but also in terms of the sustainability targets that we have an industry have set. So let's get into some of the network changes and the dynamics that have driven aviation. And again, a lot of these go back to 2004, just to give you a perspective. The expansion and the versatility of commercial aviation. Over the last 20 years, the number of routes served by commercial jets and commercial airlines has more than doubled, which is incredible when you think about it. But another thing to really, I think, underscore the versatility and the deployability of commercial airplanes is just looking at what's happened in the last 5 years. In 2019, before the pandemic, there were about 22,000 airport pairs that were connected. Over the course of the last 5 years, we've gotten back to that level, which is remarkable, and I think a good and further indication of resilience. But to me, what's fascinating is the fact that you've seen 4,000 city pairs that are no longer served and 4,000 that have been added. So again, it's a very dynamic market, and it's one industry where you can deploy and redeploy these assets, especially the versatile airplanes, to adapt to changing demand patterns and to capitalize on opportunities in the marketplace. That means the market continues to be competitive, and I think again it speaks to the growth of our industry that there's more competition in the market from an airline perspective. About 90% of the world's airline revenue is generated in markets where there are at least 2 airlines flying on the same route. So that's, to me, again, another indication of the dynamic market that we serve, but also the need to continue to innovate in the market with new airplanes, new business models, and ultimately the service that sets airlines apart to customers. Okay, so just going back again, like I said, we delivered 20 years ago the 1500 737 NG. We're now past 11,000 737s in our history and in deliveries, and we've passed 1,500 in terms of the number of 737 MAX aircraft that we've delivered to the marketplace. And so a couple stats here that you'll be able to see. The in-service fleet is now over 1,500 airplanes. Over 80 airlines are flying the 737 MAX. And the schedule reliability from a technical standpoint for the 737 MAX is now approaching the benchmark that's set by the 737NG. So incredible in terms of its performance in the market. And on a daily basis, almost 5,500 commercial flights are scheduled and flown and operated by 737 MAX jets. Some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of network growth is over the last 20 years, 737s on an average basis are flown about 40% further. So the average stage length, the average flight distance on a 737 today compared to a 737 20 years ago is about 40% longer. Makes sense because we went from 737 Classics to 737 NGs and now 737 MAX aircraft with more capability, more versatility, and airlines are using that capability in the marketplace. And so over time now, you look back, double the number of city pairs, more than double the number of seats, and triple the available seat kilometers. And that, again, it speaks to the size of the aircraft moving up, but also the range and the deployability of these aircraft across global networks. And so I guess the best way to sum this up is if you've flown, most of us probably have flown on a 737 because about 32 billion passengers over the 737's history have flown on some 737 throughout the global network. So now I'm going to pivot to the 7E7 or the 787 as we know it today. 20 years ago, this is when we launched the program, and it looked a little different than it does today in terms of the stylized or the artistic look. But what's remarkable about the 787, in my perspective, is the fact that in just 13 years of commercial service, the 787 has now become the most popular passenger wide-body in history. Last year, in terms of orders and deliveries combined, it passed the A330. Then, in the summer and fall, it passed the 777 as the most ordered wide-body aircraft in history. And I think it speaks to the value that we launched in 2004, but also in terms of the additional capability, the family that we've built around the 787 over the course of the last 20 years. An interesting stat that might surprise you, maybe it doesn't, is that the 787 already connects the most countries of any wide-body aircraft, of any aircraft globally. It now connects somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 unique country pairs, and that's a title that it quickly ascended to after the pandemic, basically replacing the A330 in that role as far as the medium and long haul country connector. And I think just from a kind of bigger picture standpoint, other than the economics, other than the size and the capability of the aircraft, how does the 787 kind of stand up in the marketplace? And it's really about the family, the 7878, the 787-9, and the 787-10 that provide the value our customers need. Over half of the orders and operators fly more than one type of 787. And over 1,000 of our orders for 787 have come from airlines, leasing companies that have already ordered the jet. So a second, third, or fourth order for the 787 really kind of prove out that it's doing what we hoped and doing what we need it to do in the marketplace. And I think another interesting thing is, you probably heard the catchphrase point to point, many times along the way. And I don't know that point to point is necessarily the right phrase, because in many ways you're connecting passengers through hubs and connecting and generating that network demand. However, there's no disputing the fact that over the last 13 years, airlines have used the 787 to launch more than 400 new routes that hadn't been served by any airplane prior to that. So fascinating to look at what's happened and then that base that airlines will use to grow from going forward. We don't want to forget the 777 because again, the 777 has been such a game changer in the market, from twin engine economics global capability, and then also the fact that it carries both passengers and freight very efficiently. 20 years ago we delivered the 500, now we're well over 1,500 in terms of the total demand for the airplane, which means, and I get to say this twice, right? The 787 is the most popular passenger wide body. Well, the 777 still retains the overall wide body title because we have delivered so many freighters and still have a backlog of freighters in the market. And on top of that, obviously we're building the 777X to continue in that long haul market leadership role. In fact, what's fascinating from a long haul perspective is the fact that despite the success of the 787 and even to some extent the A350, the long haul market leader, when we talk about truly long haul routes, over 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometers, there are still more scheduled flights on 777s than any other airplane type. So this is the market segment. This is the type of demand that we will see going forward for the 777X, namely and specifically first the 777-9. And so achieving type inspection authorization over the past few weeks has just enabled us to continue flight tests now with FAA on board and continuing on the process of certification of this aircraft for its entry into service later next year. And again, this just continues the legacy of the 777 for that large end of the market. When you think about a quarter of global long-haul capacity is on aircraft larger than 330 seats, this is the only solution for those airlines that need a 400-seat airplane for the long term. And I want to take a little bit of a detour here and talk about air cargo because it is such an important part of the global transportation system as well. E-commerce is really driven and continues to drive growth structurally in the marketplace. And you can just look at this stat to see how much e-commerce has grown over the course of the last 20 years and project in terms of what that means for air freight and air cargo and the need for freighters to carry all that between countries. We've seen a tremendous amount of momentum in recent weeks for the 777 freighter, but this isn't brand new demand. This is demand that we've seen and we've worked with our customers on over the course of the last few years and just has really come to fruition over the course of the last few weeks. Turkish's additional order, Emirates' additional order, and now today's announcement from National for new 777s for their business just, I think, continues to underline how important air cargo is and how fundamentally this is a growth market for airlines and those that operate dedicated freighters. Our position in the market is very strong because of the platform, because of the design philosophy that we have on all of our airplanes, whether they're passenger or dedicated freighters. And our goal going forward is to make sure that we continue to have a solution for every segment of the freighter market, whether it's converted 737s all the way up to the 777-8 freighter, which will be the world's most capable freighter when it enters service in 2027. All right, so with that being said, I just want to introduce our commercial market outlook that we launched on Saturday. Many of you may have already seen it, so I don't want to spend too much time on it other than to say one of the key things that we continue to look at is fleet productivity. And what's interesting about the single aisle compared to the wide body market, and again, now we're looking back to 2004 and forward to today to see how some of the fleet productivity metrics have changed. You can see in the single aisle market, seats have outgrown the fleet. On average, the average single aisle aircraft is getting slightly larger because of densification in the cabin, but also because we're delivering more larger aircraft. We used to deliver more 737-700s. Now we're delivering the 8-size aircraft on the MAX, and eventually it'll be the 10. Same thing on the Airbus side. But in addition to that, single-aisle aircraft on average are flying further. We're not seeing as many ultra short-haul flights. We're seeing aircraft being used to their capabilities, and that's helping to drive even more capacity growth in the market. On the wide-body side, even though we've seen some of the same things happen, average stage lengths are higher because wide bodies are being flown longer distances to take advantage of their capabilities. The average seat size is actually not growing. And that's, I think, a factor and a function of the 787, the game-changing size and capability of the aircraft, enables airlines to match capacity with demand in the wide-body space. And so we've seen kind of a move to the middle. Single aisles are getting larger, wide bodies are getting smaller in some ways, and those are for the right reasons, just in different market segments. The other thing I think is really interesting to look at is productivity in terms of some key productivity metrics. So here we have a backward and a forward-looking metric. We're looking back to 2003, 2004, and looking forward to 2043, where our commercial market team thinks that the industry is headed. And the biggest takeaway I would have here is the fact that, airlines have found ways through yield management and more active inventory controls to maximize load factors on the aircraft. And we all know that, we all feel that when we fly. There's not a lot of additional load factors that airlines can go out and get. We're not going to see average load factors in the high 90% on an annual basis in 2043. And so there's limited upside in that space. Airplane utilization, because of capability, because of technology, and even reliability, has risen quite significantly over the last 20 years. And we see upside in this market as well in terms of airlines being able to fly a little further, do a few more cycles and hours over the course of the week. But there's not as much upside in the next 20 years as what was achieved in the past 20 years. The other thing is the average seat size. We've seen a steady increase, about a seat and a half a year in the industry over the last 20 years. We see upside, but not quite as much as we saw over the last 20 years. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is as these productivity metrics continue to rise, as airlines find as much possible productivity out of their fleet, there's a limit to some of that. And as they need to grow even further, as we see demand continue to grow, at some point that is going to result in the need for even more aircraft, because the maximum levels of productivity will have been reached. So our long-term forecast, like I said, many of you have already seen it and possibly even written about it. The key thing here is the resilient market. The fundamentals are still there. The fact is, our outlook is very similar to last year's outlook, just grown by about 3% because we're on a larger base. So we expect that passenger traffic, based on 2023, will grow at about 4.5% per year going forward. But if we anchor back to 2019, that longer term growth rate is more like 3.5%. So moderating, but still robust. And then the fleet growth, the average fleet growth rate over the next 20 years is about 3% as well. What that means is the airlines around the world will need about 44,000 new commercial airplane deliveries. The vast majority in markets served by airplanes that are single aisles today. About 9,000 aircraft in the wide body space makes about 20% of the market. And we do see a shrinking market in terms of the regional jets, about 15% lower forecast than last year. And that's just a function of the economics of single aisle jets, the fact that there aren't really new regional jets in the market, and just the resources around the world and how those are allocated in the commercial space. We're also in the most balanced market that we've ever seen from a diverse regional standpoint. Around the world, there are 4 main regions that each command about 20% of future market demand. Europe, Asia Pacific, China by itself, and North America. Very similar to last year's outlook. And the rest of the world makes up another 15 to 18% of demand, especially in developing and emerging economies. So, 2 things that we like to tweak and continue to evaluate as we go through the year is 1, what's the demand for new deliveries, but 2, how is the fleet going to change? In other words, how are those deliveries actually going to be used? And the way that we have it laid out this year is that about half of the airplanes will be used for replacement, and about half of the airplanes will be used for growth in the market. And that means that the fleet will grow from about 27,000 airplanes at the end of last year to just over 50,000 jets at the end of 2043. Very similar to how we viewed it last year, but there's a rising amount of replacement demand pent up in the near term, but more kind of maturing in the long term which continues to drive that demand towards replacement. On the cargo side, I think I already kind of teased this out when we talked about some of the recent orders that we've had, but cargo traffic is increasing pretty consistently now. We've seen 5 to 6 months of double-digit year-over-year growth in the marketplace. So it's not just a one-off, it's a structural growth in the market as industries restock, as semiconductor demand continues to rise, and e-commerce clearly is the tailwind behind a lot of this overall demand. And that's with or without some of the maritime disruptions that we've seen, although obviously in the short term that continues to be a benefit for air cargo as well. That reliability, the speed of air cargo is something that many shippers value, especially in uncertain times on the oceans. Just to give you a sense of what demand for air cargo is from the e-commerce side, this is just from 2 or 3 emerging e-commerce platforms. Companies that have started up over the last 5 years are shipping about 10,000 tons per day of air cargo. Think about it in terms of airplanes, that's the equivalent of about 100 777 freighters a day. So there's a lot of demand out there. We continue to find ways to support customers out there, but it's something that will continue to grow with e-commerce as we look forward. So our freighter forecast, which is somewhat a subset of our commercial market outlook, but a little bit of an aside as well, because not only do we forecast new production freighter deliveries, but also freighter conversions, and where we take demand for passenger aircraft that eventually are converted into freighters. Our outlook is about 2,800 new and used freighters delivered to the market. Very similar to last year. Some of the mix change, we see slightly more demand in the large wide bodies because of the e-commerce phenomenon. And on the single aisle and medium wide body side, maybe a little less than we forecast last year because the productivity of those airplanes is rising. And so our freighter fleet outlook is that we'll see close to 4,000 freighters in the global fleet by 2043 compared to about 2,300 freighters today. And you can kind of see the mix of deliveries between new large wide bodies, which are largely factory built, and then the standard body freighters, which we project to be all converted airplanes in the long term. On the services side, we will announce a much more in-depth services outlook, but just to give you a little bit of a high-level view, we see the number of skilled employees doubling in size over the next 20 years, really with the fleet. We see maintenance hours almost doubling, but not quite, because again, new airplane technology, airplanes like the 787, 777X, with longer maintenance intervals will actually save some maintenance hours over time. But the line events will increase with the age of the fleet as we look forward as well. So overall, that means that there's a $4.5 trillion market for commercial services, mixed between spare parts, MRO and modifications, and then the digital tools to make airlines run efficiently going forward. On the training side, we think that there'll need to be about 2.4 million new skilled personnel around the world between cabin crew, flight crew, and maintenance technicians. And so a very much a growth market that follows the demand in the commercial fleet space. We talked earlier about the fact that replacement demand in the market, half the aircraft that we deliver to the market will be new technology or will be replacing older technology aircraft. That fleet renewal in the near term is the biggest piece of decarbonization as we look in the next 5-10 years. And then beyond that, finding ways for airlines to operate more efficiently, scaling sustainable aviation fuel, those are the keys to unlock the progress towards zero emission by 2050, or zero net carbon emission by 2050, in addition to all the advanced technologies that we're looking at today that eventually could find its way into future commercial platforms. So I guess the way that I would summarize our view of the market is kind of obvious. clearly we've seen how resilient the market is, and I think going forward we're looking at the fundamentals that drive and have driven air travel over the long term. The supply chain that we have, the production system that we're working to stabilize and build even more quality into, is going to provide the basis for us to grow and support the growing needs of the commercial market going forward. Because, like I said, this is fundamentally still a growth market. This industry, demand for air travel grows faster on a growth percentage basis than the global economy. And so the work that we're doing today puts us on a platform to grow from, to support the needs of our customers, not just next year and the next 2 years, but for the next 2 decades. So with that, I think I'll leave you with just a page showing our product line, and the fact that our goal is to make sure that we provide the most efficient, most capable, but also most versatile tools for airlines to use to continue to innovate and to develop the solutions for their global networks. With that, do you have any questions? Sure.
Hi.
Well, I guess we'll start with you.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just looking around, so we'll go. You can go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ed Lee with Airways magazine. I was wondering, you mentioned earlier with the in terms of forecasting things like that. You mentioned that you over forecast and you under forecast at the same time. I was wondering, is there any preference to whether you do over forecast or under forecast, and can you influence that?
Our forecast? Oh boy, that's a hard. Don't know that I fully understand the word. I mean,
I can rephrase it.
Our goal is to be as accurate as possible, and I think over time the CMO, as we sort of nickname it, has proven itself to be a pretty moderate view of the market. Rarely are we overestimating the demand in the market, but I also think that we're not significantly under forecasting any given year. Different base years will give us different biases, right? After 9/11, after the global financial crisis, we were probably impacted in a negative way because of what happened in the prior years. But overall, I think we take a bigger picture view to really try to not be too influenced by the near-term events and think in terms of the perspective of what drives demand over the long term. So I would say our history has shown that we've been pretty consistent, we've been pretty accurate, and neither too optimistic nor too pessimistic, if that makes sense. Right.
Yeah, Stephen Novak with Aero Telegraph. You showed a chart that says the number of seats per aircraft on average will rise, right?
Yes.
Is it because the airlines are choosing the bigger models, for example, A221 instead of A220, or is it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
And or is it because more airlines choose a more dense cabin? What are the main factors there?
Yes, I think it's both. We did a study last year or the year before, really to look at historically what's happened, and I think there was equal contribution between upgauging to larger single aisle types and densification. In other words, putting 6 or 12 or 18 more seats on your existing airplane. And we think the same thing is going to happen going forward. I think what's fascinating to watch is how airlines are able to differentiate and use the space in their cabins to find the right customers, the right revenue in terms of their target. But also, we've seen airlines really look for finding ways to lower their cost per seat, right? And so the two ways to do it are larger aircraft, which from an efficiency standpoint can provide lower operating cost per seat, and adding more seats to improve the operating economics of those existing planes. So I would say going forward, it's going to be a little bit of both, but in the long term, you'll probably see larger aircraft after airlines run out of the ability to densify.
Can you say something about the densifying in the world regions? For example, at the moment we see a lot of really dense cabins in Asia.
Yeah.
What is your expectation for Europe, for example?
Well, I mean, in Europe, I guess a great example of that would be the 737 MAX 8 200 seat. The Ryanair flies 197 seat 737 MAX 8. No difference in size than the MAX 8 that we serve or deliver to customers. And what enables them to have is more dense cabin, lower cost per seat. And when you have intra-European stage lengths with flights of 2 hours or less, it's perfect because you're able to maximize revenue and lower the cost per seat. I think we're going to see more of that, whether it's on a Boeing plane or an Airbus plane in this market. What's interesting in the U.S. market, I think, is there's a wide variety of uses. You see airlines, for example, 737 MAX 8s can fly from anywhere between 150 to over 200 seats, depending on the operator. But again, it's all about what market, what customer they're targeting. And so I think providing that flexibility to our airline customers, enabling them to do what they think is best for their networks. But overall, I think the densification trend is something that we're seeing in every region. Yeah.
Alan Brown, Air Transport World. You'll have seen that Fly Dubai put out an extremely irritated press release this morning, complaining both about the fact that they're going to get no more 737s over the rest of this year, and complaining also about the repeated extremely short notice changes to scheduling. Can you make a general comment on the problems with why they're not getting any more aircraft this year, and when will you be able to get out of this pattern of very short notice changes?
I think, obviously don't have any specifics on Fly Dubai. What I would say, based on the general request that you have, there's no doubt we've disappointed our customers, and we've disappointed them, over and over again in many cases. The work that we've been doing this year to make sure that we have the quality and the stability in our production line, in our supply chain, is designed so that we don't disappoint our customers going forward. We need to create that stability so that we can provide not just a quality airplane, but a quality airplane when we tell our customers that it's going to be delivered. And I think both of those things together are really important for us, and that's why we're taking the time that we're doing now. And so, our goal, and I think of the progress that we've made even to date, put us in a better footing going forward.
Tim Robinson, Aerospace Magazine. You guys won the bet with Airbus in the past to prove point-to-point versus Humvee bespoke. 787 is still in production, A380 not. But the rise of long-haul narrow-bodies in the Airbus A321XLR, do you see that cannibalizing wide-body sales, eating into them?
I don't. I'd be willing to sort of make a friendly wager too with Airbus on that part of the market. I think airlines are always going to use relatively more capability, right, to fly unique markets that they're able to connect. But long-haul single aisles are not going to fundamentally or structurally change long-haul networks. It's only possibly going to enable fringes of networks or markets to be served. And as our airline customers have told us, the longer you fly, or the further the network requirement is, the more important a differentiated product inside the airplane, air cargo in terms of the value proposition are, and those are two things that are very difficult to do in a long-haul single-aisle jet. And so a couple years ago, we showed a stat that said about 0.3% of single-aisle capacity is flown on long-haul routes, like over 5,000 kilometers. That hasn't changed, and it won't materially change. And so we don't see that as a fundamental impact to our wide bodies or Airbus's wide bodies demand either. I just don't think it changes the way that networks are structured.
Darren, considering, following on to that, the limit of a single aisle long range airplane, I keep thinking about the 787-3.
Yeah. A short range wide body is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Is there any thinking at Boeing about coming back to that idea and revisiting it?
Well, I mean, I think we're always looking, right, at ideas. And I think the one thing that you bring up that probably makes some sense is at the end of the day, whether it's this year, next year, or in 20 years, airlines are going to run out of slots in key dense markets. They're going to run out of gates. And ultimately, the big demand markets are the big demand markets. And so that push on average seat size is still going to increase. We think that the 787 does an incredible job today, flying anything from, Tokyo to Fukuoka all the way to, Perth to London. So it's able to do all those things on the same platform. And there are things that you can do with the operating weights of the 787 to optimize it for, shorter and medium haul routes. But I think we'd always look at what we could do going forward to serve that market. But I mean, nothing specific at this point. Back in the corner, I might take a little while to get to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Darren. Dave Shepherdson from Reuters. You probably saw the news today about Ryanair lowering its profits and reporting softness in fares. Obviously, we saw similar announcements from American, Delta, and United, and we've seen some capacity cuts in the U.S. In the forward cuts. Do you see any material change in sort of airlines' delivery plans as a result of this short-term softness, or do you see, given the long lead time to get in line to buy new planes, do you see carriers continuing at pace?
Yeah, I guess I would say, obviously, we've read some of the same headlines that you're talking about. I would say, the biggest thing to keep in mind is the industry is going to be far more profitable this year than it was last year, and even more profitable this year than it was in 2019. So, airlines might be pulling back on some of their outlooks, but they're not calling for a demise in demand. It's just, last year was pretty remarkable in terms of how airlines were able to get, relatively high yields. It's probably just more of a little bit, more reality in the marketplace in terms of the settling. Still strong demand. Load factors are at record levels. You might see pockets where airlines move some of their capacity to different markets because of, maybe hotspots and how much capacity has been added over the last few years. But we don't see, significant trends of